So John Bhaita, so almost on the time right now. Should we start? Or should we give a few more minutes?
Nope, we should start right now. We always start on time. That's actually, we should set that agenda with everybody. So this is exactly right on time. So Albida bhai, we can start. I'm gonna say a few words. I'll hand it off. This is gonna be a really jam-packed session. তোমাদের সবার জন্য এটা হবে খুবই চমৎকার একটা জিনিস, হাতে কলমে সবকিছু শিখে যাবে যাতে তোমরা এই 6টা সেশনের পরে হয়ে যেতে পারো. I would say take the test and you become certified and then you start doing it. I'll give you very few words and then I'll jump right in. আমার নাম হলো মোহাম্মদ মাহদিউজ্জামান, ডাকনাম অপু. I live in New Jersey. I'm a manager for Solution Architecture team. এবং আমাদের কাজটা হলো যে আমাদের কাস্টমারদের অনেক বিজনেস ইনিশিয়েটিভ থাকে. এই ইনিশিয়েটিভটা যে কোনো একটা আমাদেরকে বলে যে আমরা এই জিনিসটা করতে চাই, এটাকে কিভাবে তারা ক্লাউডে ডিপ্লয় করতে পারে সেটার আর্কিটেকচারটা দেখানো, এবং our team or myself we stay with them. তাদের সাথে আমরা সবসময় থাকি all the way at the end. আমি অ্যামাজনে আছি অক্টোবর 2019 সাল থেকে, এটা অলমোস্ট 20 মাস হয়ে গেল. One of the things I found in Amazon is that you are always learning something new. Every day আমি দেখি লঞ্চ অ্যানাউন্সমেন্ট মানেটা হলো যে নতুন একটা প্রোডাক্ট বের হলো, বা নতুন কোনো এক জায়গায় এটা রিলিজ করা হলো, বা নতুন একটা মেজর ফিচার বের হলো. So something in that range, it's always happening in Amazon Web Services. So what is the benefit of it? Technology এত দ্রুত বদলাচ্ছে যে যারা নতুন নতুন জিনিস সবসময় বের না করতেছে, they fall behind. So that's one of the reasons that you really want to be technically expert and you wanted to have be on the edge, like সবসময় সবার থেকে একটু আগে যেতে হয়. তাতে প্রবলেমটা কি? তার মানে আমি তো একটা জিনিস ভুল করার সম্ভাবনা থাকে, কারণ আমি তো জানি না যেটা আগামীকালকে কি আসবে সেটা জানি না. So take it easy, you can make mistakes but you learn from it and you take enough precaution. আমাজনে অনেকগুলো জিনিস আছে যেটাকে বলে লিডারশিপ প্রিন্সিপাল. This is what we live by, যে একটা আছে লার্ন এন্ড বি কিউরিয়াস. সবসময় নতুন নতুন কিছু আমরা শিখবো, সবসময় কিউরিয়াস হব. দিস ইজ নট সামথিং উই অনলি টক অ্যাবাউট, উই টেক ইট টু হার্ট. সো আজকে আমরা অনেক কিছু শিখবো, এবং শুধু তাই না, এটা 6 সপ্তাহের একটা কোর্স. আলবিদা ভাই পুরো জিনিসটা সবার জন্য ডিটেল করে দিবে, নাইফ ভাই পুরো ক্লাসটা রান করবে. বিফোর ইউ ফিনিশ দ্য ক্লাস, আমরা সবাইকে তোমাদেরকে একটা সার্ভে দিব. প্লিজ মেক শিওর দ্যাট ইউ ফিল আউট দ্যাট সার্ভে. As well as soon as the class is finished, you will have full access to do 72 hours lab. যা যা শিখলা হাতে কলমে সবাই ল্যাব করার তোমাদের একটা এবিলিটি থাকবে. সো feel free to utilize that. কোনো অসুবিধা নাই. এটার জন্য কারো কোনো ক্রেডিট কার্ড লাগবে না, কিছু করতে হবে না. একটা লিঙ্ক দেওয়া থাকবে, লিঙ্কে যাবা. এখানে আমরা একটা দেখাই দিব, নাইফ ভাই যখন ডেমোটা দিবে তখন দেখাই দিবে কিভাবে জয়েন করতে হয়. সো ইউ ক্লিক অন দ্যাট লিঙ্ক, ইউ গো ইন, লঞ্চ AWS কনসোল, এবং কনসোলে গিয়ে আজকে যা যা শিখাবে সেটাও শিখতে পারো. তারপরে যদি সময় থাকে ইউ ক্যান ব্রাউজ অ্যারাউন্ড, মেক ইউরসেলফ ফ্যামিলিয়ার, তাই না? হাতে কলমে, উই কল ইট এ বিল্ডার কালচার. AWS এটা সবসময় আমাদের খুবই একটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট জিনিস, এন্ড এভরিবডি নোজ দ্যাট. আমরা শুধুমাত্র কথাই বলি না, আমরা এটা করে দেখাই. সো আমরা আশা করব তাই. আমাদের টার্গেট হলো বাংলাদেশে 1000 জন AWS সার্টিফাইড লোক বানানো. এখন শুধু AWS এর জন্য না, দিস অ্যাকচুয়ালি মেক্স ইউ আ ক্লাউড এনেবল. প্র্যাকটিক্যাল মেজর একটা ইমপ্লিকেশন আছে এটার জন্য. তুমি যদি সার্টিফাইড হও, এই মুহূর্তে আমি দেখলাম যে 26,000 লোক আমরা হায়ার করতেছি. 26,000 লোক একটা কোম্পানিতেই. আরেকটা স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্স আমি দেখছি, 2025 সালের মধ্যে 3,29 মিলিয়ন লোক দরকার হবে যাদের স্কিলটা নাই. সো ইউ বিকাম রিয়েলি হাইলি স্কিলড, হাই কমোডিটি. সবাই তোমাকে খুঁজবে, তোমার জব খুঁজতে হবে না, জব তোমাকে খুঁজে নিবে. সো উইথ দ্যাট আই স্পেন্ড মাই টাইম অলরেডি. সো আই এম গোনা হ্যান্ড ইট অফ টু আলবিদা ভাই, and he's going to go over exactly what the certification mean, and then afterward Naif bhai will start the training session. তোমাদের যদি কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে তোমরা চ্যাটে দিবে. আমাদের কয়েকজন মেন্টরও আছে এখানে, আমরাও চেষ্টা করব উত্তর দেওয়ার জন্য. এবং এখানে কয়েকজন সার্টিফাইড আছে, যেমন মিম আছে, তারপরে আরো কে কে আছে, তোমরা যারা যারা আছো তোমাদের নামটা চেঞ্জ করে AWS মেন্টর এটা তোমরা লিখে দিও তোমাদের নামের মধ্যে, তাহলে তারা বুঝতে পারবে, দেন ইউ ক্যান অ্যান্সার দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন। সোহাগ আছে, সোহাগ ক্যান অ্যান্সার, ফারসিম and some other people, and they know how to use event engine। যে কোনো ধরনের প্রবলেম হবে, there is no stupid question or simple question or dumb question or anything like that, okay? So ask all the question. So with that, Alvida bhai, I hand off to you.
Thank you, John bhai. Just to talk a little bit about the logistics. Actually, before I do that, আমি আমাকে introduce করতেছি। আমার নাম হচ্ছে আলবেদা সাদিক। I'm also solutions architect. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, with AWS almost I think 16, 17 months now. As Jawan Bhai said that, learning and be curious, it's one of the main leadership principle, and that's what that I like about AWS. Every day there's new things to learn, and as you learn more, you feel better because something they didn't know before yesterday, now you know today. So, and it just continues, right? With that, with that notion, with that sort of motivation behind, inshallah, we thought about this session for all of you, and hopefully you learn and you will enjoy. As John Bhai said, it's a 6-week session. The আজকে হচ্ছে আমাদের প্রথম session, and then we have 5 more sessions that goes all the way to August 27th. And আমরা consistently চেষ্টা করছি যে একই সময় করার জন্য, যাতে আপনারা sort of put this in your calendar, you keep coming back to us. Hopefully you enjoy as well. And throughout the session, Naib Bhai and all the instructors will go through some quiz, just to kind of get you the flavor, right? How the exam will look like, so that you know. And then, as Jan Bhai said, there will be moderators who will be available on the session to answer your questions. So normally, যেহেতু it's a short session, 2 hours, lot to cover. So it's gonna be mostly presenter talking. And after the যদি কোনো question থাকে, please put it into the question board, and we'll answer to our best ability. But we'll just try to make sure that we don't interrupt our instructor just because the time is not too long. So that's sort of the high-level logistic. In terms of certification, now AWS say, there are many certifications. I highlighted a few of them. There is a foundational one which kind of gives you the cloud, like what is cloud about, and the benefit of cloud, agility, elasticity, general overviews of AWS cloud. And then you have an associate level certification. There are three certifications there. One, the one that we're kind of paying attention in this series is the Solutions Architect Associate. But there's also SysOp Administrator Associate as well as Developer Associate. So something that maybe you're interested in future once you've complete this one. And then once you start kind of using AWS and you start feeling better about it, more in depth, differently, there's other certifications that are the professional level, which is again Solutions Architect Professional and DevOps Engineering Professional. So these are sort of the certifications that definitely you may want to look at, and we'll be here. If you like our program and you want to continue to do something similar, inshallah, after the interested moto kore, we will try another certification programs as well for you guys. And once you take all this, you also have the option to specialize in a specific field. That could be, as an example, networking, specialties, machine learning, as an example, or Alexa skill builder, data analytics, and database. So you can also specialize and go take some of those courses. Now, not necessarily যে আপনাদেরকে এই ফ্যাশনে যেতে হবে, right? You can take, as an example, you can do Solution Architect Associate, then you can jump into professional, or you can jump into one of these specialties one, right? So it's based on your interest and what you want to learn. You have many ways to kind of navigate this certification journey. So in terms of today's program that we have, or this series that we have, Solution Architect Associate, how do you prepare for it, right? There are 4 domains that you want to pay attention to, or the marks are categorized, right? First one is design resilient architectures, which covers 30% of your questions. It's basically, as an example, when you have an application, how do you make sure that it stays up, right? তো আপনি কি ধরনের কম্পিউটার সিলেক্ট করবেন, আপনার কি ধরনের storage use করবেন, network use করবেন, right? So it kind of gives you some of those insights. Once you have your application highly resilient, how do you make sure it's highly performant, right? অনেক সময় there might be a lot of traffic coming in. How does it scale up, right? Again, how do you make sure network is robust? How do you make sure your compute is robust, right? So this talks about that aspect. And then, of course, security is, as we call in AWS, such as job zero. It's like #1 priority for us. But if your application is secure, it's not really no use, right? So in that case, how do you secure applications? How do you create users, groups? How do you encrypt your data? That's 24% of your exam questions. And finally, the cost optimization, right? So one of the main reasons a lot of corporations are going to cloud because it is cost optimized, right? There are various ways you can optimize your implementation now. So we'll talk about that as well. And that's 80% of the questions. So that kind of makes up to 100% of your exam questions. Now, in terms of length, so it's a 130 minutes. So it's a little bit over 2 hours. সেখানে 65টা কোশ্চেন থাকবে, so at average আপনাদের you kind of have to time out 2 minutes per question. Some questions might take a little bit longer, some questions might take a little less. So you just have to, and we'll talk about some of the techniques. How do you prepare for it, right? Now, multiple choice questions. So there could be some questions would be saying pick one answer as an example, right? Select the best answer. Sometimes there would be multiple response. There would be 2 or more correct answers, right? So there'll be 2 different flavors there, but the question will kind of highlight whether you have to pick one or you have to pick more than one. And the scoring that for you need to pass to get the certification is 720 out of 1,000. So that is your kind of passing criteria. Now, কিছু জিনিস আমি highlight করতে চাচ্ছি যে with these 6 sessions that we have, all our goal is to kind of give you some insights, like what are the key important topics that you may want to pay attention to, and then how do you prepare, how do you write the exam. So kind of give you that kind of preparatory focus, right? But one thing I want to highlight is that this is আপনারা যদি মনে করেন যে we'll just go through 6 sessions and that's it, we're ready for the exam. That may not be enough, unfortunately. কারণ আপনাদেরকে you have to put some extra time. That's the reason we spaced it out a week, between 2 sessions. So inshallah, maybe you can, study some of the materials that we'll refer in those 2 weeks, and then in each week, and then get ready for the next session. So that just keep up and put some extra time, whether after hours or weekends, inshallah, and be ready for that. So that when you are gone through six weeks, you're ready to write the exam, inshallah, very soon. Other thing that you have to do is there'll be Naib Bhai will go through some practice questions and stuff, but that won't be enough. You have to go through additional practice questions. There are many other sites that that we will talk about that you can go and write those practice questions, but that is absolutely important for you to go through. With that note, I don't want to take any more time now, Bhai. I know you have a lot to cover, so I'll hand this over to you. And thank you everybody for giving us 2 hours of your time on Friday night. Inshallah, you will enjoy, and hopefully all of you, I like to see all of you certified eventually with AWS and, start your journey with our cloud. On that note, I'll hand over this to you.
Thank you, Albeda bhai. একটা question এসছে chat around 15 point something marks per question. So just to clarify, ওখানে exactly একটা questionের waiting কত ওটা বলা থাকে না। আর অনেক সময় certification team actually নতুন question try out করে। So you don't necessarily know which ones are graded questions, which ones are not. you will only get the final marks. So don't take it as 65 questions divided by 1,000. That's the number of points per question. Try to answer each question as best as you can. So with that, let me start sharing my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. So welcome everyone to the session. My name is Naif, and I'm a solutions architect with the telecoms vertical in AWS. And I'm based in Canada as well, in Toronto area. I'm almost 20 years old. So it's an exciting time to be in this space, especially with telecoms and cloud. And part of the reasoning is obviously that we're seeing a lot of these telecom vendors move into the cloud space, especially for different functions, mostly around legacy applications where they have technology stacks which are 20 plus years old, and they're trying to move them to the cloud. They're trying to modernize them, but also with new technologies like 5G coming in, they are looking at how can they move fast. And that's one of the key values that cloud is bringing, where you can really move fast. You can really innovate at a large scale. So it's really an exciting time. যেমন ভাই যেটা বলছিলেন যে সামনে খুব তাড়াতাড়ি এরকম একটা সময় আসবে যেখানে আমাদের enough resources থাকবে না যারা cloud trained. So I would definitely encourage anybody who's looking for getting into this space, or anybody who's looking to get better at this space, please take this seriously and do as much as you can to prepare yourself. So today for the session, my hope is that I provide you guys with the introduction to the core concepts of AWS. So this includes compute and identity management. And the content is not exhaustive. So this is not all the things that you need to know. Think of this as more of a preview of the basic things that you need to know about these services. So, I will encourage that you do some additional reading, practice some hands-on workshops after the session. And, I'll share some of the details of, where to go to get more information and, how to get to those hands-on sessions. So stay tuned for that. In terms of the session that we have here today, so we'll start with the introduction to AWS Cloud, and we'll follow that with 4 services that we're going to cover. And we'll show some sample questions at the end to give you a flavor for how to approach the questions that show up in the exams. And you'll see that it's not just about knowing the content, it's more about applying the content in a specific context. And so we'll go through that to give you some idea of how to get around that. And as Albeda Bhai was mentioning, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We can address it that way. And if we have time at the end, we can go over some of the questions in live format. So let's get started. Introduction to AWS. So as you know, like in 2006, AWS began offering IT infrastructure services to businesses. And this was in the form of web services, and which is now called cloud computing. And one of the key benefits of cloud computing is the opportunity to replace upfront capital infrastructure expenses with variable costs that scale with your business. So businesses no longer need to plan for and procure servers and other infrastructure weeks or months in advance. Instead, you can just spin them up in minutes, and you can do that for hundreds of thousands of servers and deliver faster results. And there's many benefits that our customers are seeing, but some of the key ones are around low cost, obviously. So you keep your costs down by using only what you need to use. But you also get that elasticity and agility because you can get the IT infrastructure that you need as soon as you want it. So typically for an enterprise, it takes months to go through procurement, get to the suppliers, get them to bring their hardware to your data center, and then spin them up. So you don't have to do all that. You can just click a few buttons and you have servers available for you. So that gives you a lot of agility in how you move. But also, if you need extra capacity, you can turn them on in minutes. And if you don't need them, you can turn them off. So that gives you a lot of elasticity as well as to how you grow and shrink your capacity needs. We also offer an open and flexible environment. And what I mean by that is you can run any type of underlying technology on top of these services. So for example, if you want to code in .NET, you have that available. If you want to use Java, Python, they're all supported. You can run a whole range of OSs. I'll cover that later in the presentation. But essentially, it's open and flexible for you to do whatever you need to do for your customers and for your specific job function. It's also secure. So we've gotten a lot of security compliance certifications, and this is throughout the world. And so, some of the heavy security focused companies are building on AWS, and that gives you assurance that there is enough security built into the services. And Albert was mentioning that security is job zero, and you will see this in the exam on not only on how you design resilient systems, but how can you make them more secure. So always think of security as a key element as you're going through and practicing for the exam, but also as you're building on AWS. And of course, lastly but not least is sort of the global reach. And I'll get to it a little more in the next couple of slides on what I really mean by that. It's not just about having presence with AWS in various parts of the world, but it's really how we've designed it and how we've designed it to stay connected, how we've designed it to stay up and stay secure and communicate throughout the world. And so it's truly amazing once you start looking under the hood on what's really there at AWS. So in terms of the global infrastructure footprint, we have what we call 25 regions. So these are geographic locations in the world where you have 2 or more availability zones. And what we mean by availability zone is 1 or more discrete data centers. And each of these data centers have redundant power, networking, connectivity that are housed in separate facilities. So this reach is very important because you can replicate your solution in any region in the world in minutes. And data stays in the region where you place it. And this is important for a lot of considerations. In some countries, you are required to place the data in that country. And then that's a requirement for doing business. And so you're able to satisfy those requirements using specific regions, specific availability zones. And the availability zones help you to take advantage of low latency performances. So if you need systems to be very close to each other, you can do that by putting them in availability zones. And we've been increasing this footprint for over the last 15 years. In the first 10 years of operation for AWS, there was 10 regions globally, or 11 regions globally, actually. And in the last 5 years, we've been adding 14 more. So you can just see the pace of the expansion just increasing. So just to dive a little more into what I mean by region and availability zones. So a region is comprised of multiple availability zones. So if you look at the diagram here, so this gray box is one region. In this case, we're showing US East 1, which is the Northern Virginia region. And within the region, you have multiple availability zones. And so each of these, think of each of these blue boxes as a cluster of data centers. So none of the availability zones are hosted in a single building. And that's important to understand, because if one building gets a power outage or power failure, it doesn't mean your entire availability zone is going down. Your availability zone is still going to be up. You may lose certain components of it, but it will still stay up. And these data centers within an availability zone are also fairly close to each other. So they are within 100 kilometers of each other, which means you can get very low latency between them. So you get a high throughput and latency of under 10 milliseconds between these availability zones. So the other point to mention here is, you'll see AZ written quite a lot. That's the typical terminology for availability zone. So keep that in mind as you're seeing the exam questions as well. Right. I want to talk about the edge locations as well. So apart from the regions and the availability zones, you'll see a lot of these clusters around the world, and there's 230 plus of these points of presence. And points of presence are endpoints for AWS, which are used for caching content. So typically think of this as the content delivery network. So Amazon has a service called CloudFront, which helps with caching content close to where the users will be. So if you think about an example like Netflix, where they stream video across the world, they will use these CloudFront points of presences to store content close to their end users. And that way they give you the performance of, you click on a video and immediately you start playing, and you play with the highest bandwidth possible. So this is very important, and this becomes more and more important as we get into a lot of the mobile edge use cases as well. If you have more connected devices, think of connected cars, think of connected sensors, then this will be become even more important as we go further along. So for the exam, you need to make sure that you know what the differences are, what is meant by a region, what is meant by an availability zone, what is meant by a point of presence, and try to figure out the differences between them. So what is possible in what? You will, as you learn more about the regions and availability zones, you will see that there's some services for AWS that run only as a regional service. So you can set them up for a specific region to behave in a certain way. There are other services that are global services. So once you set it up, you can configure it for deploying in any region in the world. So keep those in mind for your exam. And I would definitely encourage you to read a little more on the region versus availability zones versus CloudFront points of presence. So the one last thing I'll talk about in the infrastructure and sort of the cloud setup here is around the global network that we have. So it's all 100% controlled AWS resources. So if you're transferring data from one region to another, it's flowing through Amazon's own network and Amazon's own backbone. So it's completely managed by us. And every one of those links are 100 gig network. So it's 100 gigs absolutely wherever you're moving the data in. And in many cases, 100 gigs may not be enough. So what we typically do is there's lots of parallel links. And so this means you can operate without any connectivity impact. So you'll notice the lines going not only on land, but also underwater, right? And that's actually a fact. So we've built these cables to connect different regions through the water. So you have under ocean cables, and sometimes you'll get sharks hitting up one of the lines and cutting through the links. But it doesn't really affect, because you have so many of these parallel links that cutting through one doesn't really impact anything else. And there are a lot of these projects going on which build more and more of this fiber backbone and sort of increases the capacity that we can carry over our own network. All right, so with that, we'll get into our second section, EC2 Overview. Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, which is the full form of EC2, is a web service that provides resizable compute capacity in the cloud. And it's designed to make web scale computing easier for developers. EC2 enables compute in the cloud, and it's an interface that allows you to obtain and configure capacity with minimal friction. It gives you complete control of the resources and lets you run in Amazon's environment. It also reduces the time to obtain and boot new server instances to minutes. And so, you can scale capacity up and down as your requirements change. And it really changes the economics of computing by allowing you to pay only for the capacity that you actually use. So, if you've experienced designing capacity for your on-prem data centers, you always need to keep in mind what's the peak load that's going to be on your servers. And based on that, you will have to design it, right? So you buy for the peak capacity, but then you may not run at peak capacity all the time. With EC2, you don't need to design for peak capacity. You design for what's your consistent load, and you can scale up when you have peak capacity. And you can just do that all programmatically. So before we go into further, we need to get some terminology in line. So for the exam, it's important that you understand the right terms, and they come up in questions, but they also come up in answer choices. So you need to make sure that you know what these terms are, so that you can validate or eliminate any specific answers. So let's start with AMI. AMI stands for Amazon Machine Image. And so this is a template that contains the software configuration. So the operating system, an application server or applications. And from an AMI, you can launch an instance. And the instance is the application server itself. And instances can be launched with, you can have multiple instances launched with the same AMIs. The instance is the virtual server in the cloud. So its configuration is a copy of the AMI that you specified when you launched. So think of AMI as the images. So as you launch a specific virtual machine. So if you compare it to sort of the virtual machine world, you would get your hardware, which will compare to an instance, and then whatever image you're putting on, think of that as the AMI equivalent in AWS. And you can always launch a new instance from an AMI. So if an AMI is running, you can stop them, you can hibernate them, you can terminate them, or if they fail, you have the ability to launch new one from the same AMI, or you can use a different AMI. And you would select the instances based on whatever computing power that you need. So you define the number of cores, the number of memory that you need, and that's what you use for starting and stopping the instances. Now, every time you create the EC2 resources, you specify the region where it needs to be. And you can specify this through the management console, or you can even do this through a command line. And when you launch that instance, you also select the availability zone. If you don't select an availability zone when you launch, then we will choose one for you. So that's done automatically as well. But a good practice for designing is always to pick the availability zones yourself, so that you can design something that spans across multiple availability zones. And it's important because if one instance fails, you can design your application so that the instance in the another availability zone will be able to pick that up and manage all your requests. So you avoid sort of the entire system going down. Now, obviously, you need storage for these instances. And the way we do it is there's a couple of ways to load the root volume on your instances. You can use what's called EBS, or Elastic Block Store. Or you have also the option of using physical storage that's connected to these devices, to these instances as well. And those are called the instance store. So we'll cover more about these things in the storage session, where we have, we'll go into depth of how EBS works, how the other storage systems work, when to use which. But just keep that in mind. The root volume from which you use to boot your instances can be two flavors. You can use EBS, you can use instance volumes. And EBS or EBS snapshots are kept in another storage service called the S3, Simple Storage Service. And we'll go into it in our storage session. So I'm not going to cover it in as much detail, but this is a high level of the terms that you will see, which are related to EC2. Now, I'm sure you are all familiar with CPUs and vCPUs, so I won't go into much details around it, but keep in mind that in AWS, the default is 2 vCPUs per physical core. And so if you need to understand how many cores are there, then always divide the vCPU count by 2. And you'll know how many cores are being used. And this is because of the hyper-threading that's done on these EC2 instances. Now, you have the links here, which actually show you a lot more around that. If you need to get more details, just get to aws.amazon.com/EC2, and you will see a lot more details around how we manage these cores and what's there and all the different flavors. Now, in most cases, there's an instance type that will suit your needs, because we have different combinations of memory and number of CPUs for different workloads. But you can also specify the CPU options to optimize your instance for specific workloads. And so you can choose the number of core to memory ratio. And you can even disable the hyper-threading. So if you want the vCPU and to match with the core count, then you can remove the hyper-threading from these from the cores, and that's an option that you get as well. This won't be a question in the exam, but keep in mind the concept of GibbyBytes. So when you see numbers and when you see anything to do with storage and memory, we're not using gigabytes, but we're using what's called GibbyBytes. And this goes into sort of the mathematical accuracy of how we calculate storage and memory. So a gigabyte is 1 billion bytes. Whereas GibbyByte, instead of having that factor of 1,000, you go by a factor of 1024. And so, you will see a difference in, the total number of bytes when you use gigabyte versus GibbyByte. So for AWS, all the memory and storage is calculated in GibbyBytes. So just keep that in mind. For EBS, you will see the maximum volume is 16 tebibytes. And again, it's not terabytes, so tebibytes. So always look out for that little I before the B, and that'll tell you what this number is. So just a point to note for the exam. Now, when you run your EC2 resources, you are not sharing any vCPUs or memory. And AWS has architected the cloud in such a way that different customers can be sharing a physical server, but will never be impacted by each other due to the network and security segmentation. So, you kind of avoid that noisy neighbor scenario where, somebody running something on the machine next to you may have impacted you. So that's not a case. For the exam, you will need to know the different instance types. So look at the line at the very top where it says general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, accelerated computing, storage optimized. So these are the different classes of instances that are available on AWS. So depending on your need, you would pick one of these instances. And so the general purpose, again, just by definition, that's the most commonly used instances. And these come at a very good price performance angle. So if you don't need heavy usage, then you would always go for the general purpose ones. The T classes are usually for transient workloads. So if you want to try something out, if you're doing workshops and labs, you'll see a lot of times we just recommend using T-class instances because they give you the power required, but you don't need to go get extra capacity and power. You have the compute optimized where your core to memory ratio is increased. So you have more cores per memory. And on the memory optimized one, it's the opposite. So you have more memory per core. So those are the common ones. So memory optimized, you'll see it being used for things like databases, where you would need a lot more memory to run the specific workloads. But you also have accelerated computing, and this has grown in demand over the last few years, because this is where we use hardware accelerators. And that does a lot of things like floating point number calculations, graphics processing, and that makes it more efficient for certain software to run on the CPUs. And so there's different types of accelerated computing offers there. And there's obviously the graphics-based ones, but we also have FPGA programmable hardware as well. So that helps with specific scientific workloads. You also have dense storage instances or storage optimized instances. And this is where you require high sequential read and write access to large data sets. So think of Hadoop distributed computing or any parallel processing of data warehouse or any log processing application. And so this gives you a lot. It's usually the best price per gigabyte storage and price per disk throughput across EC2 instances. So if you're looking for things that need to read and write across a very large data set, then that's the one that you would go with. For the exam, you don't need to know all the details in terms of the instance classes. So for example, T, M, C, which ones fall in which, but you do need to know the different categories of these instances. And the other comment I'll make here is we offer these instances with processors from a different set of different range of vendors. So you'll see Intel, you'll see AMD, you'll also see ARM, and that one's very special because ARM has designed specifically with AWS for these instance types. And so these actually, the ARM processors give you a huge price performance benefit when compared to Intel and AMD. And they're also much greener. So if you look at some of the documentation around these ARM processors, they take about 20 to 30% power consumption than what your typical Intel or AMD processors would take. So it's definitely pretty interesting to look into if you want to dive further. So when we name instances, you will see this as a terminology of what the instances are and how to understand what instance I am running. So EC2 naming is done with the instance family as the first letter. So in this case, we see C. And then you have the instance generation. So we're on the 5th and 6th generations right now. So you'll see a lot of 5 in there. And then N, the next one, that's an optional parameter for attributes. So you may see this, you may not see this in some of the instances, but N stands for network. And so it's basically, if this instance is optimized for network performance, you will see that N. You can also have D, which stands for local storage. You also have M for metal as well, so for bare metal servers. And then after the dots, you have the size of the instance. So you can have small, medium, large, extra large. It can go up to 8x and 12x large as well for some instances. So this is just to give you a sense of how that instances are named. And so when you see one, you will know exactly what this instance type is, what family it comes from, what generation, and how many cores that it's running. And as I was mentioning, these instances support a wide range of operating system as well. And if you don't see something on this list, it may still be available through the marketplace, the Amazon AWS marketplace as well. And you're also able to port some of the older applications onto AWS by modernizing or moving some of them to a newer version of Linux. So, we face that in our regular work quite a lot, where we have older versions of operating systems that may not be directly supported on AWS, but then you have to figure out, how we can port them over. And so, keep that in mind. We're adding new versions every time. So that's why I didn't want to specify the version names here. But if you go on the EC2 website, you will always see the latest version of supported operating systems. And as of last year, we support Mac OS, which is powered by Apple Mac Minis running in the AWS regions. I don't think you will see them in the exam questions because it's so new, but this is just for your awareness that these are supported now. All right, so let's get into some purchasing options. EC2 provides a lot of different purchasing options, and you can use them to optimize your costs based on your needs. And so the most common one is on demand. So this is essentially paying for the compute capacity by the second. And so there's no long-term commitments that you need to do. You just go on the console, you get whatever instance you need, and you just run it. There's no additional activities there. Now, if you know that you have a committed utilization, then you can go and make a 1 or 3 year commitment. And what that allows you to do is you save a significant amount of the on-demand prices. And so that's what's called a reserved instance. So for example, if I know I need a C5 instance for 1 year, then instead of paying the on-demand price, I can go and reserve that instance. And then that will give me a cheaper rate on the per hour cost that I'm seeing. For other workloads, you can use what's called spot instances. And spot instances are essentially unused EC2 instances. And so when the EC2 instances are not being used by any customers, those are made available to you as spot instances. And these have significant savings from the on-demand prices. Sometimes you see up to 90% savings from the posted on-demand pricing. The only thing to keep in mind with spot instances is that if the capacity of customers increase, the spot prices will also increase. And in that case, you may lose your work if you need to if you need to give up that instance. So what happens is it's a demand and supply way of managing these instances. So if the supply of unused instances increase, the prices go down, and if the number of unused instances start decreasing, then the price starts going up. And when you define spot instances, you specify what number, like what's the price that you are willing to pay for these spot instances. So it's a great way to save money on certain things. And if you know of this app called Yelp, Yelp has done a great job of using spot instances to power a lot of their compute resources. But keep in mind that whatever you are using spot instances for need to be fault tolerant, because if it gets interrupted, it needs to be able to come back and resume that work on a different instance. And we've also introduced saving plans recently, and this makes you, instead of tying yourself to a specific EC2 instance, you can make a commitment around a dollar amount that you spend per hour, and you can share that discount across compute options across different regions as well. So you don't need to specify that I need a C5 instance for 1 year. You can say, I am going to spend X amount of dollars for the year, and whatever compute resources you're running can leverage those savings rates. So when you optimize your design, you can combine these multiple purchase options. And here's an example of what you will see in a typical cost optimization scenario. So you will see that for the steady state workload, you're using reserved instances. And so, you know exactly how much capacity you need, and you get the best rate possible for that capacity. Now, if you have spiky demand where I'm going to need more capacity for the next 2 weeks, you can scale up on demand, where if you see the middle layer there in yellow, that's the on-demand piece. So as your capacity is increasing, you just keep adding more servers to manage it. Now, if you have to go beyond that, spot is always a good one to look into, because if you know that it's very variable in terms of how the demand will be, then you can look at spot to augment your on-demand data flow as well. And so this is what, for example, Yelp has been doing, is when a user searches increase, they increase the pool of spot instances that are being used. And once that search capacity need has been exhausted, then they just give up those spot instances. So you don't have to get into any commitments or anything of that sort. And customers have asked for a lot of flexibility with using spot and other pricing models, and so you can scale across all three of these purchase models: spot, on-demand, RIs, and scale with multiple instance types as well. So you can have a lot of flexibility with how you manage your growth within AWS. And some of the service features that really help with this is EC2 auto scaling, which means you can define a configuration of how your EC2 instances scale up and down. So you can say, if I'm running at 70% utilization, then spin 2 new clusters, and you can do that programmatically. You can have EC2 fleets running, so multiple EC2s running together, and you can manage them and manage their scaling together. You can also use container-based services. So for example, ECS, Amazon Elastic Container Service, or EKS, which is the Kubernetes version of that. You have ThinkBox, you have EMR to run some of the heavier workloads and distributed workloads. And you can templatize a lot of this with CloudFormation. So for example, your launching configurations and the number of instances you need, you can put them all into a template so that if you need to deploy in another region or another AZ, you can just deploy that template. And you don't have to set up these EC2 instances and the storage one by one when you go to the next deployment. And in the last year, there's the feature called hibernation. So previously, this was not possible. You would either turn the instance on or off, but you can now use hibernation, which then saves you more costs from an operations perspective as well. I don't think hibernation will be on the exam just because it's very new in terms of announcement, but keep in mind that that is possible. So if we go a little deeper into the architecture of EC2, so we're using modified versions of Zen and KVM hypervisors. And when an instance is launched, we look across our fleet for an available slot to run their instance. When the instance is launched, we hard partition both the memory and the CPU allocation. So we're not oversubscribing memory or we're not, causing any issues to the instances that are neighboring it. Every instance must be launched with at least one security group, which controls all network access in and out of the instance. And security groups control access regardless of whether the instance is talking to another instance attached to the same hypervisor or within the same availability zone or across the world. So we'll get into a little more about security groups in our network session, but this is just to give you a preview of how EC2 instances come about when you compare it to a physical server. And in terms of hypervisor, so hypervisor usually isn't a major topic in the exam, but you will see answer choices that refer to them. So we started, when Amazon started AWS, it started with the Zen-based architectures, and it was heavily customized for AWS's use. And the hypervisor consumed resources from the underlying host. So if you were getting a 4-core, 8 GB instance, then the hypervisor would consume resources from your pool of compute and memory. And so the optimization opportunities there were limited. And that drove us to look into different ways of managing hypervisor. And that's where we came up with AWS Nitro. It's a custom KVM-based hypervisor, which was introduced in 2017. And it uses less server resources. And it actually offloads a lot of the hypervisor functions to a separate processor, which means if you are asking for a 4-core and 8 gig processor, for instance, for yourself, then you get to use the full power of that capacity. You're not leveraging the same compute for the hypervisor functions as well. And so Nitro's formed the basis of a lot of the EC2 innovations over the years, which is why it's a good one to know what Nitro is and how it helps with EC2 hypervisor maintenance. So with the Nitro system, I won't go into too much details on this one, just because there's lots of material available online. If you want to read further on the Nitro, you can go ahead and do that. The key point I'll make here is the Nitro system is not just the hypervisor aspect of it, but it also helps with the security and the scalability of EC2 instances. So you actually have the way of enhanced security, and it monitors the hardware and the firmware as you're running your EC2 instances. So there's a lot of that built into how Nitro operates. So we talked about the AMI before, the Amazon Machine Image, and this provides information required to launch an instance. And you can launch multiple instances from the AMI. And it typically includes a template for the root volume. So, the operating system, what type of applications will be there. You can also have launch permissions, which controls which accounts can use the AMI. And you have block device mapping that specifies the volumes that you can attach to the instance for storage. So think about a scenario where you need to provision multiple EC2 instances. EC2 placement group allows you to define how to group a set of EC2 instances, and how to get for your best performance. So you have three types of placement groups, where the first one is cluster placement groups. This means all the EC2 instances that you spin up will be in one availability zone. So this gives you low network latency and high network throughput. So if you have multiple EC2 instances running the same application and they're sharing data across each other, this is a good one to use. And for the exam, just keep in mind, if they don't mention any placement groups, then cluster is always the default. Now, you can also have spread placement group, and this will strictly place a small group of instances across distinct underlying hardware. So it can be in the same availability zone, or it can be in multiple availability zones. But the idea here is that you are not putting all your instances on the same hardware. You also have the partition one, and this one is in multiple zones, multiple availability zones. So you spread your instances across logical partitions, such as group of instances in one partition do not share the underlying hardware with groups of instances in different partitions. And this is typically used by distributed systems that are massively replicated in terms of the workloads. So think of Hadoop or Cassandra. And so you don't want them all running on single hardware anywhere. So security groups, as we were mentioning, the key elements are stated in this slide, and they will be covered further in the network session. But as I mentioned earlier, security groups are used to manage inbound and outbound traffic from your EC2 instances. And so there's different ways of doing this. Keep in mind that security groups are stateful. So if you have an inbound traffic request, you will have that's allowed, then the response to that that is outgoing will also be allowed. So keep that in mind. It's a key element that differentiates security groups with network access control lists or NACLs. So that's all I'll say for the security group here. We'll cover it more in a later session. And AWS provides a rich set of metadata that is available to an instance by querying a special URL. And this is only available from within the OS of the instance and can help with infrastructure automation. For example, the instance may need to know its instance ID and can query the instance metadata service. Another example may be that the instance needs to know which availability zone it is in to apply availability zone specific configuration details. So within your instance, if you go to this link, then you will get a lot of this information around the metadata that's collected. So let's do a quick poll. I want to see if you guys are paying attention. So you can follow along with us in the chat here with your answers. So what are the valid underlying hypervisors for EC2? And you can select two answers. So you can just pick the option numbers here if you'd like. And I'll give you 15 seconds until I show the answer. All right. So as we mentioned, we started off with Zen, and now we have Nitro, which is becoming the default for all the newer instances. All right, let's do one more. When creating a new security group, all inbound traffic is allowed by default. It's true or false. So I know we kind of skipped it quickly, but let's see how many of you were paying attention. All right. So let's see. I see a lot of falses in there. So it's actually true. It is allowed by default for inbound traffic. So we can get into more details around it on the next session. All right, so let's get into our next service here. And that's identity and access management. And so for this one, we're going to go through some of the key features of how you manage users and how you manage their permissions within AWS. Now, AWS Identity and Access Management enables you to manage access to AWS services and resources securely using IAM, and that's what it's called. So you'll see the shortened version being used more commonly, IAM. And so using IAM, you can create and manage users and groups, use the permissions to allow and deny their access to AWS resources. IAM is a feature of your AWS account, and it's offered to you at no additional charges. And you're only charged for use of other AWS services. So you don't actually get charged for using IAM itself. And IAM makes it easy to provide multiple users secure access to your AWS resources. It enables you to manage users, their access. You can create users in the AWS Identity Managed System, assign users individual security credentials, or you can even request temporary credentials for users to access AWS services. And you can specify control permissions to control which operations a user can perform. IAM also supports the access for federated users. You can request security credentials with configurable expirations for users who you manage in your directory. And so you can allow access for your corporate employees without needing to create a separate IAM account or an AWS account for them. And so we'll talk about federated users in a little bit just to show you how that works. For the exam, you will need to know that the different ways that you can give permissions to access AWS. So federated query often comes up as part of the questions. So the key terminologies for IAM. In this case, you have, you need to be fairly familiar with these terms, because the differences between them may be what makes or breaks a question. So you might get them as part of the question, but you might also get them as part of the answer choices. So you need to be able to differentiate between users, groups, roles, etc. So users are end users, such as people, employee of an organization. Groups are a collection of users. So you can put these users into different groups, and then you can set permissions for the groups themselves. So you don't have to individually set permissions for each user. Roles are similar to users, but they are assigned to AWS resources. So a service from AWS can take on a role to access another service. So for example, if you are running a translation service, you can give them a role which allows them access to the storage where the translated documents are stored. And so that is done through roles. So a key distinction there is roles can be assigned to services and not just users. And then policies are documents, and these are JSON documents that give permission to what a user, a group, or a role can do. So policies form the basis of how you determine how the permissions are set up. And AWS categorizes the IAM access using different principal entities. And so these principal entities are things like the account owner ID. So this is the root account. So when you create an AWS account, this is what gets created. So it's the root account. And it has complete administrator access. So for security reasons, you should not use the root account other than for emergencies. Right after you create an AWS account, one of the first things you should do is create an IAM account, which may have admin privileges, but do not use the root account for anything else. If you start using that and you get that compromised, then that means your entire AWS account is at risk. Now, then you get to the IAM users, groups, and roles. And they have similar functions to access specific services, APIs, or customer support. But one thing to keep in mind is IAM supports implicit deny. New users have no permissions when first created. And temporary credentials can also be granted to access services and APIs, but these are the easiest to revoke. So you would have these services and APIs that you give people access to, but then you can also revoke them with either programmatically or with API calls. And so when you're authenticating as an IAM user, there's two ways to do it. For the access to the console, you use a username password, and you might even have multi-factor authentication that you use to join. And so when you're setting up users, you get the option to select whether it's a console access only or whether you need to give API access to. So the management console, as I said, has passwords that you define, or you can set up password policies as well for these users. So you can define things like character combinations, expiry, rotations, to make sure you play around the console and understand what's possible there. For the API access, once a user is created, it also gives you what's called the access key ID and a secret key. And keep in mind that this is created at the time of account creation. So you can't really go back and create this API access at a later point of time. And so, play around with the account that you get today, create some IAM users, and you will get to see how these work. From an exam perspective, you will not get a direct question on multi-factor authentication, but it's important to know the difference and the different supported options here. So you can use a virtual MFA device. So think of your smartphones, or you can use like a Google authenticator or Authy, two-factor authentication. But you can also use hardware-based tokens as well. So something like a SurePass ID, which gives you the time-based 6-digit tokens. And the advantage of using hardware-based ones are that it's a dedicated device. It's got a long battery life, so and it's also lower risk of unauthorized use in case you are concerned with the security around it. And then you can support multi-people usage with this, and so that's one of the key advantages of using hardware key fobs. But then with the prevalence of smartphones, virtual MFA devices are usually the more common approach. So let's talk about the roles for a little bit. Similar to an IAM user, IAM roles are an identity in which IAM policy is attached to dictate what actions it can take and what it cannot do. Also, these objects can be used by person, services, and custom code for gaining access to and performing tasks within AWS. Unlike IAM users, IAM roles make calls to AWS Security Token Service to retrieve short-lived one-time usage credential for authentication. So that's the difference between one of the key differences between roles and users. Users have permissions that are there, whereas roles get, I think the default is 1 hour that you get. So when you're accessing something, you have to request a temporary token to get access to the specific services. And so roles do not use username and passwords. It's the better approach for federated access. And you can even use one IAM role to assume a different role. So you are able to kind of nest around the roles itself. So we were talking about federated support. So here's an example of how that works. So these roles allow you to support ID federation from an identity provider that may be on-prem. So think of a Windows Active Directory. So your browser interface will take you to the Active Directory on-prem, and that allows you to authenticate to your on-prem service or your ID provider service. And once that's done, it passes that authentication response to AWS. And that's where we would create a temporary credential for that federated user to access the console. And then you get access to the console and do your own thing with the AWS services. The IAM policy, so this is where you set up your permissions. As I was mentioning, this is a JSON formatted document. So this helps you define what a principal entity is allowed to do in an account. Principal is the entity, or it's a person or application that is authenticated using an IAM entity. So a principal can be an IAM user or an IAM role. And access management for this part, so it basically assumes that the principal has been authorized to get to this part. And you manage the access in AWS by creating these policies and attaching them to these identities. So you will see in the policy statement, it will specify the principal. It will specify the action that the principal can take. It will specify the resource on which this action can be performed. And it can also talk about any specific conditions that you can define. And so here's at the bottom, you'll see an example of how this looks like. So for example, in this case, you are giving full access to DynamoDB service. And so the principal isn't labeled here, but when you apply this policy to your account, you will see the principal showing up. And you have the effect, which says allow, and the action is DynamoDB and star for any operations. And the resource is the exact DynamoDB table that you will be performing actions on. identity-based policies are permission policies that you attach to your identity. So in this case, you can provide identity-based policies which can control what actions the identity can perform on which resources and under what conditions. And these policies can be classified by a couple of different things. So you can have managed policies, which is usually standalone policies that you can attach to multiple users, groups, roles in your account. And you can have AWS managed policies, or you can have customer managed policies. So AWS managed policies are created by AWS, and they give you a standard set of policy management and access JSON documents, but you can also define your own with the customer managed policies. And the other alternative there is inline policies, in which case you put the policies into the user group or role. And so these are meant to be disposable or temporary. So the recommended way is to use the managed policies, just because they are actual policy documents that you can attach to users or roles, and then you can remove them easily. But if you need to have something done for a temporary reason, then you can use inline policies. Now, for the exam, also keep in mind there's another type of policy called resource-based policies. And resource-based policies control what actions specified principal can perform on that resource and under what condition. So resource-based policies are typically inline policies, and there's no managed resource-based policies. So to enable cross-account access, you can specify an entire account or IAM entities in an account in a resource-based policy. So you can either apply it at the identity-based level, or you can apply the policies at the resource-based level. So keep that in mind as sort of the two major distinctions here. So in summary, some of the key points to remember for the exam, and I'm going to read this slide, but I will recommend that you review the frequently asked questions for IAM on the AWS website. So I'll share that link at the end of the presentation. So IAM consists of users, groups, roles, and policies, and it is universal. So it does not apply to regions at this time. So whatever changes you make will be a global change, not specific to a region. The root account is simply the account created when you first set it up. It has complete admin access. And so as such, you should always take great care with the credentials. New users have no permissions when first created. And new users are assigned access key and secret access keys when first created. These are not the same as password, and you cannot use the access key ID and secret access key to log into the console. You only get to view these once. If you lose them, you have to regenerate them and save them in a secure location. It's always recommended to set up MFA for your root account, and you can create and customize your own password rotation policies. So when you're trying out the labs today, I would really recommend you to try out these these settings on IAM as you get there. All right, so let's do another quick poll. Let's see how we're doing. Which of the following is not a component of IAM? Roles, users, organizational units, groups. All right. You guys are pros here. That's amazing. I'm seeing a That's awesome. All right, let's see. You are correct. Number 3 is correct. So organizational units are not part of IAM. That's part of AWS organizations. We'll get there in just a few minutes. But yeah, absolutely. Great job. Next one. This is a longer question. When you create a new user, that user and fill in the blanks here. We'll be able to interact with AWS using their access key ID and secret access key using the API, CLI, or SDK. Or we'll be able to log into the console only after MFA is enabled. Third option, we'll only be able to log into the console in the region in which that user was created. We'll be able to log into the console using their access key ID and secret access key. So let's see how we do. All right, so I see a lot of ones, but I also see a lot of fours here. So 1 is the right answer. We'll be able to interact with AWS using access key ID and secret access key. So remember, access key ID and secret access key will not allow you to log into the console. You can use that for the APIs, for the CLIs, for the SDKs. So any non-user interface, you can use that. Now, number 4, we'll be able to log into the console using their access key ID and secret access key. So that was the wrong answer because you're not allowed to do that. You can only log into the console using your username, user and account ID and password, and the MFA if you've set that up. So just keep that in mind going forward. All right, so let's get through a couple more services, and then we'll get to the end with some summary questions. So AWS organizations, so we'll cover that. But before we do that, I'll give you just a basis of why we need AWS organizations. And so now you've set up your EC2 instances, you've set up your IAM credentials, permissions, etc. And IAM solves that critical problem around securing your account and managing permissions. But as you scale up your usage of AWS, you might come across a scenario like this, where somebody needs access to EC2, somebody else needs access to AWS Elastic Beanstalk, and somebody else now needs access to RDS databases. And once that's all set up, you get a new team that comes in and says, I want to work on a special project, and they want their own VPC set up with full admin privileges. And the whole work of this is, typically in the on-prem setup, it's the operations guys that will set up all these things for you. And then all of a sudden, you might also find that somebody's been running some, heavy compute servers for 4 months, and we don't even know what's running on it, right? So it's just you get into a lot of these complications as you start building up and scaling up your environments, that you'll see IAM may not just be able to scale as much. And so you might have scenarios where a single AWS account will not satisfy your needs because of just the different type of things that are going on with the different people using it and the different teams that are running different workloads. So in that case, you would need to create separate AWS accounts. And then the question becomes, how do you manage these set of AWS accounts together, right? How do you define some common guardrails? How do you define some common security parameters so that you're not having to chase each of these accounts one by one and try to configure them? And so this is where the concept of a landing zone comes into play. And so a landing zone essentially means that it's an AWS environment that has multiple AWS accounts under it. And it gives you the ability to configure them and allow different people and teams across your organization to start using AWS in a secure way, but also in a scalable way so that you can build from that. And AWS Organizations is the service that helps you manage these complexities. So from an exam perspective, you will not be required to know AWS Organizations in great depth, but you will be required to understand the key elements of it. And so we'll cover what are the key terminologies for AWS organizations. So for the basic components, so you will have this diagram you'll see here. It shows the basic organization that consists of 7 AWS accounts. And these AWS accounts are organized into 4 organizational units, or OUs, under the root. So start with the root. So this is the root organization, and under it you can define organizational units. And organization units doesn't necessarily need to be single AWS accounts. They can have multiple AWS accounts under each of these organization units. And you can have the organization set up several policies that are attached to some of the OUs or directly to the accounts. So you can set up security policies for the accounts themselves, or you can set them at an OU level, which means any accounts that are under that OU will have and will automatically inherit those security policies. And so, as I was mentioning, the root is the parent container for all accounts of your organization. If you apply the policy to the root, it applies to all the OUs, and it applies to all the accounts in the organization. And the OU is the container for the accounts within the root. So it can contain other OUs as well. So for example, if you look at this particular one, it has 2 other OUs under it, and each of those OUs can have their own permissions and policies for the users. So that's also possible with the organizations. And of course, you have the member accounts as I was showing. Now, the policies that you define in organization are called service control policies. And it's a policy that specifies the services and actions that IAM users can take, and anything that's explicitly denied as well. So SCPs specify the maximum permissions for an organization unit or account. And when you attach the SCP to your organization root or an OU, the SCP limits permissions for entities in the member accounts. So from a high level, this is all you need to know about how organizations are set up. That you have the root, you have the OUs, and you have the member accounts, and you can apply policies across them. And then you need to know that SCPs are service control policies that essentially specify the level of access these entities can have. The other benefit of organizations is it comes with 2 flavors. So you can have the all features flavor, which is the default. And in this case, it includes functionality of consolidating billing, but also advanced features that give you more control. So for example, when all features are enabled, the management account of the organization has full control over what members' accounts can do. And so management account can specify those SCPs and restrict access to services. In the second flow, you are only using organizations for consolidated billing. And so in this case, you're not necessarily setting security features or permissions to the organization, but you are just seeing you're just putting all the billing of all these accounts under one pair account. And so both options are available. There are different reasons why you may choose to either use the consolidated billing or the full features, but it's there for the exam. Just know that there are these different flavors. All right, so we'll go into one last service for today, and this is the AWS single sign-on. And AWS single sign-on lets you pick between AWS SSO, Windows Active Directory, Azure AD, or other SAML identity providers as you source for identity and sign in. So you can choose different options here for how you federate your identity on AWS. And SSO is essentially the service from AWS that helps you consolidate them in one place. Now, you can every single identity provider will have a different way of how they interact with AWS SSO. So I won't go into all the details around it, but it's very similar to what we saw in the federated identity service in the IAM section. And you are also able to now integrate with external identity providers. So single sign-on now allows for providers that support SAML 2.0 as well. So there's a wide range of services that you can use. And in terms of the directory services, so if you have a Microsoft Active Directory that you're using on-prem, then there's a few different ways that you can use. You can replicate the feature on AWS. And the first one is the AWS Directory Service for Microsoft Active Directory, also known as AWS Managed Microsoft Active Directory. And this enables your directory-aware workloads and AWS resources to use the managed AD in AWS. So this is actually built on the Microsoft Active Directory service, and it doesn't require any synchronization or replication of data from your existing Active Directory on-prem. So you can build your AD completely on AWS and have your applications just point to that instead of your on-prem AD. And you can use the standard administration tools here, the same that you use for your on-prem AD. And you can set up the group policies and single sign-on and all that. Now, if you want a simpler implementation, you can go with the Simple Active Directory, as the name suggests. It's a standalone directory in the cloud, and it supports basic Active Directory features. And it comes in two flavors. So you can have a small one with less than 500 users, or you can go up to 5,000 users. But keep in mind that this is not a full featured version of AD. So it doesn't support things like trusts. So you can't join on-prem Active Directory to it. Now, if you don't want to implement Active Directory at all on the cloud because you have a setup already on-prem, then you can use the Active Directory connector. And so in this case, you are essentially pointing back to your on-prem directory with the supported AWS services. So users can log into AWS using your on-prem credentials, and it's going to fetch those from your on-prem services, on-prem AD. All right, let's do another question. You want to allow users of your company to log into AWS console with their Active Directory credentials. Which of the following services will not meet your requirements? All right, so I see a lot of, I see a lot of 4s in there, which is correct, but I also see 3s and 2s in there. So let's get to the answer. You're correct, 2 and 4. So whoever said 2 and 4 is correct. So one thing I want to mention here is, if you look at the question, this was, one of those a little trickily worded questions, right? Which of the following services will not meet your requirements? And so that means you're not looking for the ones that have AD or that support AD, but you're looking for the ones that don't. And so Cloud Active Directory and Cognito user pools, those are not Active Directory services that you can use. All right, so great job, everybody. Abeda Bhai, for the survey, do you want to put the link in here now, or do you want to do it in a little bit?
না ভাই আর আপনার কতগুলা ডেক আছে?
So now we
হবে?
can go into the sample questions. I'm done with the content.
Okay.
আমরা এরপরে just exam question
Yeah,
কয়েকটা করবো।
অবশ্যই আমি তাহলে পোস্ট করি। So again, thanks again everybody. মানে আপনাদের almost 2 ঘন্টা সময় দিচ্ছেন, we really appreciate that. তা আমি একটা সার্ভে লিংক পোস্ট করব। This is very important for us and for these sessions in upcoming session, কারণ আমরা জানতে চাচ্ছি যে what went well and what we can work on and improve, because at the end we want to make sure that you get value out of this all the sessions, right? So well, so please, onto that, it takes only a few seconds to fill the survey in. So give us some feedback, what you liked, what we can work on, and inshallah we'll make it better for future sessions. Now, একটা question আছে যে how was the hands-on lab? So এটা almost you can pick anything there, because আমাদের এই সেশনে কোনো hands-on lab নাই, তবে ইনশাল্লাহ আমরা আপনাদের সাথে ওই AWS console environment share করবো soon. Then you have 72 hours to work on it. But for these 2 hours, there's no hands-on lab. So, just fill in whatever you think you want to do there for that question. But otherwise, Naibai, I will post a link and maybe you can start with the sample questions as well in parallel.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so maybe we'll give a minute for everybody to see if they can get to the survey, and
Sure.
After that we'll start. So
yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll just pause for 2 minutes here.
So আমি post করছি ওই the server link just maybe take a minute or so, fill that in. Really appreciate that.
Yep, thank you. And again, like if there's anything that we can do better, যদি আপনারা মনে করেন যে আজকের পেজটা বেশি ছিল বা আজকের কন্টেন্টটা অনেক বেশি হেভি ছিল, so maybe we'll try to slow it down a bit, or maybe we'll add some more content or more examples. Any of those feedback is usually good.
The other thing Naib আমার মনে হয় might be useful is that আমাদের Google Drive we have the agenda for all the sessions, right? Like what's next and following after that. আমার মনে হয় যদি আপনারা যারা participate করতেছেন, if you have some time, I know maybe we're asking too much here, but আপনার যদি কিছু সময় থাকে, maybe you just look at that content beforehand. Like let's say there's going to be a networking session, right? There's so much videos out there in YouTube. আপনারা যদি even spend like half an hour on it, maybe before coming to the next session, that might help, because maybe after the অনেকে হয়তো you guys are new to AWS and maybe there's too much information in short time. তা এটা help করতে পারে যে if you guys just spend half an hour maybe or an hour, when you have some time, go through some of those videos and then for our next session. That way it might be easier to understand all the content. 2 hours is not enough for all the materials, right? So we are trying to put a lot of information. তা আপনার যদি আরেকটু কিছুটা background থাকে যে কিছু জিনিস like IAM, you maybe read up a little bit IAM or security groups and you come to this call, it might help to clarify some of the things that Naim was talking about, That would be my 2 cents maybe for the next session.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, like এটাকে এই সেশন গুলোকে আপনারা ধরেন যে এটা একটা preview আর কি, or maybe like a movie trailer. So we'll give you the high notes, we'll give you the high points, but then you still have to go and do your own studying. And there's a lot of videos on YouTube. One of the ones that I would recommend is AWS has this event called reInvent every year, and every year they have a really good video content material coming out from reInvent. So if you are interested to learn about a service, that's usually the best place to go to find out the reInvent video of that service, and you'll get at least 30 to 45-minute video that explains exactly what the service is, what it does, how to run it. So I think most people are getting done with the survey. So let's get into some of the sample questions. So again, the idea here is to walk you through a couple of questions just to give you a flavor of how that looks in the exam. And hopefully you start thinking about the questions in that aspect. So with the questions at the exam, these are mostly scenario-based questions. So for example, this is called Solutions Architect Associate, right? So it's all about architecting systems on AWS. And so you might be given specific scenarios of what to do, what decisions to take in terms of architecting and designing. So keep that in mind as you're going through the questions. The answers aren't necessarily meant to trick you, but there will be a lot of very similar answers. And so you'll have to pick the best fit based on the keywords and based on the core message in the question. So let's get to the first one. So the question here is, you need to run a production batch process quickly that will use several EC2 instances. The process cannot be interrupted and must be completed within a short time period. What is likely to be the most cost-effective choice of EC2 instance type to use for this requirement? And your answers or answer choices are reserved instances, spot instances, on-demand instances, and flexible instances. So I know many of you will probably jump at the answer here, but the idea is not to do that, and I'll tell you why. So some of the answers may be very obvious, and in that case, you can just jump to the answers. But you might find ones where the answers conflict a little bit. And so if that's the case, then you have to find out a way of eliminating the answers. And the idea here is, if you have 4 options and you pick one, then you don't know the answer, then you have a 25% chance of getting it right. Your goal would be to increase that probability, right? So if you have 4 answers, you don't know any of them, try to eliminate 1 or 2. And if you have 2 remaining and you pick one, then you have a 50% chance, right? So that's the reason why it's important to understand the question, break down the question. So if we go to sort of breaking down the question, here are the key words that I find in the question, right? So one of the things there was batch process, right? So it's a batch process and it needs to be run quickly. The other thing that's key is it's using several EC2 instances, and the process cannot be interrupted. So this one is actually key. Must be completed within a short time period. So that's the other element. So cannot be interrupted is one, which directly talks about whether spot instances can be suitable or not, and then must be completed within a short period of time. And in this case, if you look at the question itself, you will think that spot instances may be the cheapest option, right? When it talks about most cost-effective choice, but spot instances cannot be used because your process cannot be interrupted, and so you will know that that will not be an option. So knowing this, then you can start eliminating some of the answers, right? If you look at the answer options here, 1, 2, and 3 are valid pricing models. Flexible instances doesn't exist, so you can get that eliminated right away. And then you're working on reserved versus spot versus on demand. So on demand is always the most expensive. Spot instances are the cheapest, and reserved instances kind of fall in between them. But reserved instances require you to do a 1-year or a 3-year commitment, and so then that is not the right answer here. Now, spot, again, we rule out spot because it cannot be interrupted. So then you are left with on-demand instances. So in the first glance, on-demand may look like the most expensive, but in this scenario, on-demand is the most cost-effective. because you cannot use the other instances based on how this workload is designed. So keep that in mind for as you're addressing the questions in the exam and as you're preparing for the questions, right? It's very important to understand the wording. So the next question, you have been asked to come up with a solution for providing single sign-on to existing staff in your company who manage on-premises web applications and now need access to AWS Management Console to manage resources in cloud. Which product combinations provide the best solution to achieve this requirement? Use your on-prem LDAP directory with IAM, use IAM with MFA, use AWS Secure Token Service and SAML, use IAM with Amazon Cognito. And some of these we haven't really covered in details, but again, the idea here is to understand how to approach these questions, right? You may get wording or services that you may not have heard. So again, the idea is trying to get your brains to eliminate some of these answers so that you can guess the correct answer. All right, so let's pick up what's important here. So on-premises, obviously. So they're managing on-premises and then needs access to the AWS Management Console. And then there's product combinations, right? Which product combinations provide the best solutions? So can you eliminate some of the answers here? And so that's the next step, right? So IAM with MFA, we can eliminate that. And the reason is it's talking about on-premises credentials, right? So IAM with MFA will not give you access to on-premises credentials. IAM with Amazon Cognito will, but this is the on-premises active directory credentials or on-premises credentials are typically not the Cognito. So when you use Cognito, it's usually a cloud service that's providing you the services, the identity services. So then, oops, I kind of skipped ahead. So now you have two options, right? You can use your LDAP with IAM, or you can use STS with SAML. And the key distinction here is nowhere in the question does it talk about Active Directory or LDAP, right? So it talks about a managed on-premises web application. It doesn't necessarily talk about an LDAP service. So then the product combination, we cannot assume that this is an Active Directory or an LDAP. So what's the generic way to approach this is the typical ID federation service, right? And so then number 3 is the right answer, where you say, you use a combination of STS, a secure token service, and SAML to authenticate. All right. So with that, we've basically come to the end of the session here. And I do see a couple of comments around prayer break. So if you can give us another 5 minutes, we'll just finish it off. And then, that way we don't need to take any breaks. And the recording will be available here, will be made available to you. So you can, if anybody's need to go, then they can just catch up on the recording for the last little bit. So I will leave you with a few additional materials. And so we have what's called a well-architected framework, which basically forms the basis of a lot of these design decisions. So I would definitely recommend you to look over that. The FAQ pages for each of these services, so EC2, IAM, organizations, please review them in more details. And I would also ask you to go in a bit more details around the EC2 instance types, because there is some really good information there on how the EC2s are set up, how they operate, all the different instance types, what they're meant for. as well as the pricing. So you get a sense for, when we're talking about reserved instances or spot or on-demand pricing, you will see the difference between them and why it's important to design it for the best cost performance. And AWS has a ton of exam readiness material that you can get to. So feel free to use those as to understand the type of questions that you get. And AWS SSO FAQ, as I mentioned, and the placement groups. So we didn't get a chance to go deeper into the placement groups today, but I showed you the 3 placement groups. So keep those in mind. And like I said, there's tons of material on YouTube for the reInvent sessions. Those are definitely something I would recommend for you to look into. All right, with that, I'll quickly show you the demo or sort of the hands-on workshop and how that works. And the idea is, after this, we'll give you the codes for you to try it out yourself. And it's going to give you some idea of how to get through some of these, how to understand better these identity and access management, how to spin up EC2 instances. So give me 1 second here as I switch. All right, so you should all, I'm just putting the link here for the event box, and this is what will give you the access. So if you see here, so when you click on that link, this is what you will see. And if you click on launch, it's going to give you a code. So I'm not going to click on it now, because if I click on it now, then I'm going to use up one of your accounts. So, but ultimately, it's going to come here, and what you're going to see is something like this, right? So it will ask you to use a one-time password. So if I do that, then it's going to ask me, what do I need to put in here? And so let me see. So that's the sign up process for getting into the accounts. And so you'll get an email with the one-time password, and that will essentially allow you to get access to the account. So give me 1 second here, since I can just show you how the console itself looks without having to wait for this. So it takes a couple of minutes for the one-time password to show up. So for example, now I have it. And I think I lost my screen share here. All right, so it's signing me into the dashboard, and so you will see something like this, and you'll see that this is the AWS console button at the top. So that's what you click, and then it gives you the login link. So you can use this to go into the console, but this is also what you can use if you're using command line to log in. Then this gives you the credentials to go there. So I'm going to click on this. And so this is the AWS console that I get. And so from here, you can search for different services. So you'll see some recent services here, but I can go here up at the top in the search box and type in EC2, and it's going to give me the EC2 page. And once I get that, then you are essentially in your EC2 console. And from here, you can see the number of instances that are running. You can spin up a new instance. So for example, you can go here and launch an instance. And once you have them launched, it will show up under instances running. So you are essentially able to play around and try out all the different things. So pay attention to the dashboard, pay attention to some of the sidebar high-level sections here. And if you don't know some of these, then it'll become clear as we go further in these sessions. But we talked about Elastic Block Store, we talked about images a little bit, security groups. So you'll see a lot of these coming up again and again in the exam questions. And then I can do the same for IAM. So if I type in IAM and get to the console here, then that's essentially where I get to see all my users. So right now you will only see one because only the root user is there. And so that's the one that's been created for the LAD. But you can start creating other users as well. So you can create new users. The other thing to keep in mind is when we talk about the different regions, IAM is a global service, so it doesn't need you to select a region. But when you go to EC2 or some of the other services, you will have to select which region, which geographic region you're running from. And so that gives you a sense of how to play around with the tools. So with that, that's the end of my content here. If you have any other questions or anything, feel free to put it in the Slack channel. I hope everybody's there already. And we'll look forward. We'll take a break for 1 week for Eid. And তারপরে আমাদের next sessionটা কিসের জন্য আলবিদা ভাই?
It is in the agenda.
Okay.
Sorry, don't have it open right now.
Yeah, that's fine. So I mean, it's going to be not next Friday, but the Friday after. So with that, thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully you've done the surveys by now, and feel free to access the labs and try out the different services by yourself. All right.
Thanks, Naipai. So sorry, the next session is on databases on July 30th. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And আমরা আপনাদের রাখতে যাচ্ছি না, কারণ মাগরিব চলে আসছে। ইনশাআল্লাহ আবার কথা হবে July 30th. And have a good Eid as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.